In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to use the drop-down list box control in ASP.NET. The drop-down list box is used whenever you want to restrict the possible selections of the user for a particular field of information by allowing them to click a little arrow and a little window will pop up with all the possible selections. They can choose one, and then you can retrieve back from that which one they selected. There's two pieces of information associated with every item that's found within the list box. You have the actual text and then the value. The text is what is displayed in the pop-up window that appears whenever you click the little down arrow. But the value is actually something that's not displayed but can be associated with that text value. For example, some type of an ID associated, in this case, with the last name that we're going to populate our list box with. I've created 4 little examples, and this is the first one. What I've done is use the pubs database that comes with SQL Server to create a SQL connection, a data adapter. And from that data adapter, I accepted all the defaults for the authors table and created a data set called DS Authors. And this is one instance of the DS Authors 1. And I set some properties on my drop-down list box. Let me go ahead and select that. And in this case, the first thing I selected was, what is the data source? It's the dataset authors 1 object that was added to my design form. The data member is the table that I've selected from. The data text field is going to be the last name of the author, and the data value field is the ID of the author. So what will happen whenever we click this button is that we're going to display the text that was selected and the value of that text item. Let's take a look at the code behind. All I need to do to populate our list box is to use the SQL data adapter's fill method, passing in the data set and the table name, authors. And then I need to call the data bind method of the drop-down list box. Now when they click the button, what I'm going to do for the label 1 is display the selected text. I call drop-down list 1.selecteditem.text. And for the label 2, I do pretty much the same thing except I call the value. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is go to our web form 1 and right-click and select Build and Browse, and our application appears. Let's go ahead and retry it because I already had it open. Right, let me close it down and retry it because I've tried this example once already. There we go. Build and Browse. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to select Yokomoto and select the button, and it says you selected Yokomoto, and here's the ID, the value for that selection. Okay, so that's a very basic way to data bind. You might be asking yourself, though, how do I data bind more than one field of data? And that's a little bit tricky. I tried to do this using code, but really the best way to approach this is the way that I've done it in the next example. So what we have in this next example, web form 2, is everything essentially looks the same. However, what I've done is create a different data set called DS Authors Modified. And the difference was that I created a new data set that only had 2 fields of data in it. The first field of data is the author's ID, and the second field of data actually in the select statement makes a change. Here, let's go ahead and select the SQL data adapter. We'll take a look at the properties and click on, configure data adapter. And we won't change any of the selections, but you'll notice here that the select statement looks a little bit different. Let's use the query builder and take a look at the statement that I used. So what I did was use the author's last name plus I used a tick with a comma, a space, another tick, and the first name. So it should be last name, comma, first name as AU_name. So I have something in my SQL statement that will combine the 2 names together into one. This is really the best way to get both names together into one entry on your on your box. I'm just going to hit cancel here. I don't want to change anything. But all the other settings are the same. For example, whenever I selected this, I set it to basically the same properties, except for the data source is authors modified, the data member is still authors. The text field is AU name. This is that constructed field that I created, and the data field is the author ID. Let's make sure in one thing that's very important is that you have to check for pages is postback. If you don't, whenever you make a selection, it will always go back to the first one that is in that because it will continue to fill it every time the page loads. So if not page.is postback, then this is very important. You're going to get skewed results if you don't do that. So I'm going to save this, go to Solution Explorer, and build and browse. Okay, notice this time that our fields have both names in it, Carson, comma, Olivia, Michael O'Leary. So let's pick Michael O'Leary, click our button, and you'll notice that Michael O'Leary and then his ID is selected here. So up to this point, all we've done is bound the data with no really concern for what the initial value was. But what if we wanted to set our initial value to something that's in a database field or something that the user selected from a previous page? Well, this next example is going to illustrate how to do that. I'm going to close all these down and open up Web Form 3. And on Web Form 3, what I've done here was two things to illustrate two different points. The first one is how do you make a selection of one of the items. And here what I've done is pretty much exactly the same thing. SQL Data Adapter, fill, just like you've seen before, I data bind, and then I set the selected index equal to 3. So it's going to select the third one. Now if this isn't the one that you want, what you can also do is iterate through each of the items in the drop-down list box and see if like the first name equals the first name and the last name equals the last name. If so, then get the index for that item and set it to the selected index. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate how to do that in this video. I'd refer you to a video 3420. That's a walkthrough on how to create a parent-child or master-child ASP.NET web form. And that illustrates how to do that, but we're not going to do it in this example. The other thing that I wanted to demonstrate was the use of the selected index changed. This will fire an event whenever you make a change in your drop-down list box, and what we'll do when that happens is that we'll set the label 3.txt equals a you change your selection. In order to do this, you're going to have to make a special setting. You're going to have to, as I've made a note here, set the auto postback property to true. What I've done here, let's go to the properties window, is there's an auto postback property here, and by default it's selected as false. If you do this, if it's left at false, then it will not fire that event back on the server whenever you make the selection. Instead, it will save that, and whenever you then click another button that will do a postback, it will trigger that event. So we're not going to change that for now, but you can go ahead and play around with that. So let's go ahead in our Solution Explorer and build and browse. Notice that it selected the third item because we said selected index equals 3. But suppose I want to select a different one, Loxley. Notice when I do that, that the page posted back to itself upon the firing of that event, and it says you change your selection. Now this is significant because if you ever want to make objects interact, like for example, make a selection from this drop-down list box affect what's in a different drop-down list box, you can do it by setting the auto postback equal to true, capturing that that selected index changed event, and then writing your code to populate that second drop-down list box with the values from the first. But we'll also click here, and just like before, we get the gentleman's last name, and then also his author ID. Now the last example that I'm going to show you demonstrates how to manually set the items that are in the drop-down list box. Up to this point we've data bound every single time, but you may also want to just individually just type in values that are added to the drop-down list box. And so we'll close all these down and open up Web Form 4, and I've actually given you two examples here. In this first example, we use a simple method of adding values where you're just adding the text, you're not actually adding a value behind it. So for example, we have just items.add. So dropdown list.items.add Brian, Steve, Chuck, Andrew, Andy. Okay. The second one, we've just gone a little bit further and created list item objects, and when we created an instance of them in the constructor, we passed in not only the name but also the value that's associated with Kevin and the value that's associated with Paul and so on. So this is a second method. And both these methods are acceptable. Let's go ahead and click the run. Whoops. Let's do this. Let's do run, build and browse. So I'm going to click this button, and when I do, notice it populated with Brian, Steve, Chuck, Andrew, and Andy. And when I click this button, it populates it with Kevin, Paul, Randy, and Mike. So those are the two methods of manually adding items to the drop-down list box. So I hope that this video was helpful to you, that you learned quite a bit about the drop-down list box, how to populate it, how to grab values from it, and hopefully this will help you as you go to create your own applications.